Well, hi, everybody. Happy Friday. Happy Pi Day. Good afternoon. My name is Jamila Walida Simon. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Global Development and a Cornell Boucher Scholar. I'm also a part of Cornell's employee degree program, and I'm delighted to be able to be here standing in front of you and to be able to present the summation of my dissertation research here. So I hope that you'll take this for consideration. Just want to start with sharing a little bit about myself. It's really important for me, for you to know who I belong to. And so I typically use Ricky's in order to introduce myself in my interviews, my presentations. And Ricky's are part of the Yoruban tradition where people brag on their ancestors as they pass from one life to another. And for me, I like to use them in the present tense so that we can brag on each other while we're here to receive our flowers, right? So this is that opportunity. I use these Ricky's as a part of my research. And it created a really nice pathway to begin to enter into conversations. And so today I'm going to share mine here too. So I'm Jamila Walida of House of Simon. I'm the first of her name. I'm newly minted as a community developer and daydreamer, raiser of future leaders, keeper of the voluntold, a TT slayer and best friend of all the nieces and nephews, expert of efficiency, slayer of one-liners, breaker of rules. I'm the daughter of Valerie Denise and Oswald Simon, granddaughter of Dorothy Lee and Henry Jasper Collins, Rita and George Leslie Simon. I'm the CEO, not the CEO of Radical Mama Housing, Conscious Connections Consulting, and Health is Wealth Housing. I used to begin my stories with Once Upon a Time, and now begin with Despite and Beyond Time. I translate kitchen table conversations to researchers for my translational research. And in lots of different spaces, I'm known with a title, but I'm also known for building community from the ground up, shoulder to shoulder in community by layering action and stories. So today I'm going to talk to you about 3 different chapters. And the first chapter really creates an opportunity for us to humanize scholars. A lot of times we're in a field amongst ourselves. And in social science research in particular, there's an opportunity for us to really think about the scholar as human. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the improvisation that's built into that work, and also lean into the literature base in that first chapter. Chapter 2 looks at the role of race in the pursuit of purpose, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the sense of purpose for these Black farmers, in particular that we work with here in New York State. And the last chapter is really an ode to creating a new Black farmer ecosystem, an opportunity for our young people to really inherit the lands and the earth, but an opportunity for healing. So let's dig into chapter 1, The Scholar is Human. So I want to start by telling you a story about how I came to this research, right? Like everyone else that's in a grad program, I had some really stark ideas about what I wanted to do. And really, I was finishing up my coursework right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I happened to take a really lovely class in rural humanities with Anu Rangajaram with our Cornell Small Farms program and Gerard Aking with Africana Studies. And I was excited. It said in the syllabus that we were going to be working with farmers from the region. I saw my neighbor's name on the list and I was like, yes, I'm going to work with my neighbor. And so I was excited about working with Rafa Ponte from Rocky Acres Farm in Freeville. He was working on building his bodega at that time. And I told you that I was of the voluntold. So Anu emailed me and said, would you work with Corbin Hill Food Project instead? And so being up voluntold, what did I do? I obliged, right? And so there was a point in time when I got to know Dennis Derrick, who is the economist and the brainchild, one of the brainchilds behind Corbin Hill Food Project. And I also spent some time getting to know Onika Abraham, who was the former director for Farm School NYC. So many folks know her because she's run a really enormous and beautiful training program for farmers. And I got to know Dennis Derrick in a different light because like me, Dennis Derrick is farmer adjacent, so he may put his hands in the soil for a few things, but he's not a farmer. And I got to know that Dennis Derrick had a portion of land in upstate New York where Blackyard Farm Collective actually was tending to land. And there were 5 Black farmers from New York City who had relocated to the area in order to be able to farm. And so I got to know them. I got to know them intimately during that pandemic time. But I also, on the back of my mind, kept with me that I was here with this Cornell.edu address, right? How was I going to be received in community? And then ultimately, right, how can I do this during a time when people are social distance, and really drive home that I'm here to help build community? And so what I did was, as a part of the syllabus, there was an opportunity for us to interview the farmers. I didn't start there. What I did instead was I went and I walked the land. I met all the animals that they tend to. I put my hands in the dirt with them and got a chance to get ready to help them with their harvest. And we spent time in community. In fact, after that, we spent a lot of time meeting weekly in order to get to know one another and building research relationships, which I'll begin to talk about really shortly. But during that time, it wasn't until months into those relationships that we began to do an interview, and something to keep in the back of your in your back pocket, because it was a spark for me, was that after I had completed my interviews with Dennis Derrick and also with Anika Abraham, and then these 2 farmers, there were 5 farmers as a part of the Blackyard Farm Collective at that time. And one of them came to me and said, "Can you interview me? Because it just sounds magical what that experience is like." And so I was like, okay, sure. Didn't someone else from my class interview you? And surely they did, but they talked about the magic behind the connection, right? And that the connection was really, really important to them. And so why did I become engaged in this research with Black farmers? Well, there's a short answer, and the short answer is why not? I've very much been a part of invisible communities for the lion's share of my life. This work is more than just about earning a PhD degree. It really is about building community and creating opportunities for us to be able to share privilege, highlight connections, and draw connections in community. And I talked to you a little bit about the improvisational side of the work. So a lot of the ways in which I proceeded with this work were really based on my own intuition. And that came from thinking about, how do I want to operate in community? Some of you are here from the community, and it's super important for me to develop one-on-one relationships with folks. It's also certainly important for me to think about what does a hospitality in that work look like? What does reciprocity look like? What does collaborative work really help us to build? And so the seeds from this work were actually planted when I was really, really young. I shared with you I'm the granddaughter of Dorothy Lee and Henry Howard Collins. And my grandmother actually was the first person that I observed creating spaces for hospitality and community. She grew up in Virginia. She picked cotton in Virginia, and she made her way with my grandfather to New York. They raised their children in a 4-story brownstone. And I remember the tenants that my grandmother had there. I remember the care that she took to having conversations at her kitchen table. I remember that there were places we weren't allowed, which included her stoop. We weren't allowed to sit on the stoop. That was not going to happen for us. But as a nurse at Coney Island Hospital, she went above and beyond in terms of the way that she helped to build community. And so that's also built into this work. So like many of you, I had some initial research questions that look completely different from where I landed. But I would just want to take a peek at those and begin to explore a little bit. So I will share that I was at a point in time where I was mesmerized by Black cooperatives. I spent some time in Mississippi with Dr. Bobby J. Smith, who was an alum from this department, digging in the Mississippi archives and learning about Fannie Lou Hamer, looking at all the tags, right, and all the writings about families, right, and about food and about the food movement. And it really impressed upon me, right, how all these things work together. and work hands in hand. We also had a chance to meet Jackson, Mississippi's mayor, Chokwe Lumumba. We had a time with Cooperation Jackson, and I was like, I'm on fire. I'm going to come back and do some work about Black cooperatives. And so some of the types of questions that I had were really about what lessons can we learn from Black farmers who participate in farming cooperatives? How do they develop their individual sense of purpose and maybe their more collective sense of purpose? What can we learn from innovations within the food systems in that space specifically? And then ultimately, I wanted to propose a participatory action research project that explored innovations in the food systems. So now I want to tell you about what we did. And emphasis on the we, because this work couldn't have been done without the members of this group. So you'll see across the board, we have Ocasio that's there, that's driving. We have Rev Del that's here. I hope somewhere, maybe I'm missing on the screen, there's some other farmers that have joined us as well. But these are the farmers that were a part of this research. So we have Darcia Houston and Rev Dele, who you see here, and Rev is signed on. They signed on from Soil and Souls, really excited about being able to explore their own personal histories. A shout out to Rev, because things that Rev did as a part of this group really helped to structure this work, and certainly all the fruits of the labor that have been born from this work. You'll also see in the corner Alexis Mena and Franklin Mena. They are part of University New York City and University New York City in New York City, and they're part of an ecological health public laboratory in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Right, so they're growing food in Brooklyn. I had the honor and privilege of co-teaching with Franklin Mena as a part of our Romford Burner Center for Translational Research series, and we were teaching a mycology course in Brownstone, so that was really great. And Ocasio, no worries. And then we have Ashanti Williams, who is actually one of the sole members right now of the Black Yard Farm Collective. I did have a chance to work with some other farmers that were a part of that collective, but they decided to move on to other ventures. They're not a part of the collective, and so we didn't include their interviews. And Franklin Mena is here as well. And so what we did was we slow played getting to interviews, right? In the same way that with the Corbin Hill Food Project, I didn't jump right into doing interviews. We sat and labored in Zoom calls, in-person meetings, and retreats, and opportunities where we were in person with one another. We also asked some really tough questions of one another. At times we wrote grants together. At other times we did fundraising. And we put off doing the interviews because they were really secondary to the work. The real work was really in the research relationships. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about what we discovered as a part of that process. The first part of the process that we, had discovered in conversation and being in community with one another is that we needed a new ecosystem for Black farmers. I'll talk a little bit about the day-to-day struggles for Black farmers, but a new ecosystem is needed in order for our young people to have something to inherit and for current farmers to actually be able to navigate these systems. So that was imperative. And as a part of our shoulder-to-shoulder work and in those interviews, we found that the same isms, right, that we experience as we're swimming in the world are also baked into the food system, right? And so there was no way to escape that particular experience. So how could we create a new ecosystem that was, had vanished those isms? So that was a space. In the work, we spent time reflecting together, and I'm a firm believer in reparations. Reparations don't actually always have to be economic, although that's great when that's possible. But some of the reparations that we might be able to build in are baked into the work, right? So in this particular case, the repair is actually in the work and building those relationships. And our methodology allowed us to utilize restorative practices to really build respect and to honor building some of those deep relationships. We talked about this, but the work had to be reciprocal and collaborative. not perfect. I want to press upon you, right? This work is messy, like any other work that involves being engaged in human relationships. Sometimes it's biting, sometimes it's cutting, but ultimately we entered into really rich and deep research relationships. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So according to Josselson, there's a phenomenon called the research relationship, right? Like any other relationship, we posit that research relationships take place, they evolve over time, and they're nurtured and attending to, according to Gubrium, right? There's a level of complexity that even the SAGE handbook of interview research just skims the surface on. And so if we just jump right into an interview, we actually don't have a chance to really develop a relationship. And many of us know, I know for myself personally, I've done, interviews in the past where I would just jump right in, right? I'd be happy to make this meeting and I'm jumping right in. I might layer it, right? It's scaffolded so that the questions that really are, incumbent upon building trust are towards the end, but I have no idea who this person is, right? And it's usually one-sided where I'm just asking of the person. There's nothing reciprocal or bidirectional about that. And so research relationships are guided by a process of deep listening, deep care. It's really an internal process. And so we really should move away from encouraging researchers to share their interview process, their protocol, and their questions. And some of you are probably thinking to yourself, what? And I think that it creates a really wonderful opportunity for people to really feel heard. And because of that good listening, they're inclined to share more of themselves, and the same for you. And so this special dialogue, according to Josselson, shares is made possible by understanding also your contribution as an interviewer. And so as a part of that process, because I took that role really seriously, we were able to develop really deep research relationships. So after that process of leaning into my intuition and also thinking about where things were, I wanted to also dig deep into the literature and see what the literature had to say. Of course, I'm not the first person to say that research relationships are really going to be beneficial for social science research. We also find that built and baked into feminist literature, right? Where there's a deep listening around the oral histories and the history and the purpose of advocacy. And so that was a place that I also leaned into to really support this process. I also leaned into looking at the Indigenous literature. And so that work is deeply relational in its nature, helps to really support research relationships. And it's also a space whereby each party makes and takes that relationship and they make and take meaning. So that was really an important piece of part of literature for me to lean into. And then ultimately, the space that was actually incredibly life-giving was in looking at decolonizing literature, right? That's the space where all of the pieces around the feminist literature and the Indigenous literature really speaks to power dynamics and the co-creation, right? The necessity for the co-creation of spaces, especially when they're intimate spaces. And that makes up the basis for my chapter, and the scholar as human. So the act of developing these relationships through this deeply relational interview research process really creates an opportunity for our Black farmers to be much more visible, and it helps to validate the scholarship of Black farming, right? A lot of times we don't hear about the scholarship of Black farming. We hear about the statistics of the number of farms, right, that are owned by Black folks, but we don't learn about the scholarship of Black farming. Secondly, it creates an opportunity for the academy to really think about how do we integrate community as an end, right? And that's different than integrating the academy into community, right? And so that should be a means to our work. And then lastly, the interview process is really undertaking so that we have lasting impacts on both community and academy. And so hopefully that's helpful as you think about your work. And then to just drive that home a little further, according to Naples, research subjects have the power to influence the direction of the research and to resist researchers' efforts and interpretations, add their own interpretations and insights, And we appreciate this bidirectional flow of ideas, efforts, and interpretation, and that researcher's own interpretation does not muddy how we understand this relationship. These experiences then become a set of equal relationships whereby either party can steer the results rather than have the insights that merely come from the researcher. And so I'll just say again that this study was more than just about conducting interviews. It really is a way of being in community. And I think that the promise of qualitative research, according to Klinken, is that with all the highly sophisticated talk about decolonizing academic theories and methodologies, I believe that this is the bottom line of any genuine commitment to decolonial scholarship and interest in understanding and enhancing our shared human condition in a divided and fragmented world. This work is meant to lend its voice to humanize social science research by way of telling the story and of sharing key discoveries. So that's my first chapter. Let's peek into the second chapter, right? And that's where I started. I wanted to think about what role does race play for Black farmers? And so the first place that I dug into was into the literature. And so chapter 2, the role of race in the pursuit of purpose. So I first want to set the context here. Black farmers are embroiled in a really big battle, right? They swim around in the same isms that you and I encounter on a daily basis, and then some. They also struggle to make ends meet. Like any other farmer, it's really hard to make a living growing food, and whether you're shepherding land, it's really hard to take care of oneself and one's family. I think that compounded is, I had shared earlier that those isms are being reproduced within the food system, right? So whether it be racism, sexism, adultism, right? All of those things are coming together in the food system as well. And so that compounds the Black farmer context. In addition to a lack of land access that we normally hear about, a lack of support for rematriation, a lack of community support. And we can even see that right here in our own community as we look to local herbalist Amanda David, who's been struggling for quite some time, right? With a racist neighbor, with other racist neighbors, and then having to move out of the space that she was shepherding to really help to grow and maintain community and move into another space. Combating against individualistic ideas about that this land belongs to a particular person, which is not even a thing. Isolation, I failed to mention that these farmers all belong to Black Farmers United, as do I, even though I am also farmer adjacent. And as a part of that process, we mapped out where all the Black farms are in New York State, right? And they're pretty spread out. So people experience isolation on a very regular basis. In addition to injustice that happens and being embroiled in legal battles, including with much longer term battles with USDA. So the context is really, really bleak. So when I looked into the research, I found that a lot of the impacts of racism have really negative health impacts, right? And that's all that was really being talked about in the literature. And so you'll see some of these quotes from the National Academy of Medicine. And by and large, what I want you to take away, right, is that from this vantage point, racism only has negative health outcomes, right? So there's higher stressors, there's mental health challenges, physical and chronic physical challenges, depressive symptoms, psychological distress, and that's a significant predictor for limitations. But what I wanted to do was look and dig into the Black farmer ecosystem, right? And so here was an opportunity for us to test to see if that's all that's present, right, for Black farmers. And the place that I wanted to do that was by looking at their sense of purpose, right? So our sense of purpose is intrinsically tied to how we think, how we make meaning in the world. And I wanted to look and check and make sure that the current research, which was limited and negative, and then peer into those Black farmer interviews and see if I'd find the same thing. And what I found when I looked at that lived experience is that actually racial identity can serve as a motivating factor. And certainly for these Black farmers that I was working with, that was the reason why, right? That was behind their sense of purpose and served as a motivating factor as a part of this work. And so historical experiences of different racial groups plays a significant role in shaping their understanding of purpose. For instance, the legacy of colonialism, slavery, and segregation has resulted in distinct narratives and challenges for Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized communities. And these historical injustices can lead to a collective sense of purpose that's really centered around activism, resilience, and community solidarity. That looks very different, right, than those health outcomes that we talked about. And so I got curious, but I wanted to think about the importance of purpose. And of course, I happen to have the leading expert for purpose on my committee, right? That's right here at Cornell University. And so when we think about purpose, right, it has private dimensions, it has collective dimensions, it has really deeply personal dimensions, individual dimensions, but right, the way that we understand and make meaning in the world really sits around purpose. And that might look differently across contexts, certainly across racial and cultural contexts. So according to Burrell, a sense of purpose is really integral to the human experience. It's an intention to do something, and I'd argue something really great in the world. And so scholars often see purpose as a driving force behind personal motivation. But this last part is really important. However, the pathways to discovering and fulfilling one's purpose can be heavily influenced by social, economic, and cultural factors, including race. And then ultimately, when we look to research, we find that purpose is the extent that people see their lives as having meaning, a sense of direction and goals. And so definitions are important, but they help us to really best understand the factors that comprise purpose. And in addition to the pursuit of purpose, it's not ever going to be uniform, right? So it's not ever going to be just one thing for everybody, but instead it's going to have unique meaning for each individual. And so I wanted to look at the role of race in addition to purpose, right? And so what I did was I used narrative inquiry, and that was a space that I could utilize to see the joy that might have been overlooked in the dominant research. And so this allows us to really think about the power of stories, to think about relational ethics, and to make those that are typically invisible much more visible. And so why stories? Stories add a deeper dimension, but really, right, according to Klinken, the research relationship is fundamentally a special case of a human relationship. And we have to be thoughtful about the relationship dynamics that are being created between us and our participants. This also means that the inner worlds of the interviewer and the interviewee help to co-construct knowledge, make meaning, and this means that we can and should do our parts as interviewers to be prepared to occupy this really sacred space. So back to the research relationship, right? Back to a way to really think through how we combine these worlds. And so in the pursuit of purpose, I wanted to look and understand how race shapes individual and collective experiences of purpose. And so we began to have those conversations. And so there were really three spaces that came out of that, right? Our current research doesn't fully explore race and its dimensions, and certainly race in the pursuit of purpose. And when we combine those two, right, we miss some of the alternative impacts that really lead to a greater sense of self and a greater sense of happiness. And so there were three perspectives that emerged from these interviews that I just want to talk really briefly about. So in every single interview and in all the field notes, right, folks really leaned on that they were farming for their own healing, right? Farming for their own personal healing. They were farming for the healing of other communities in terms of where they were distributing food. And that was something that was extremely important to them. But that was also tied to their race, right? To them being Black farmers. And that was a really big motivating factor for them. They also talked about farming as their avenue and their route for working out their mental and their physical wellness. So I don't know how many of you have been on farms recently, but it's hard work. So I know that I could not occupy that space, and maybe not for long. But in terms of the physical fitness and being fit for the work, I don't know if you've ever done hay bales. I attempted to do it one time. It was really hard. I don't have the upper body strength for any of that. I think I mostly played in the hay, to be perfectly honest. But think about the physical strength and the ingenuity and the innovation that you have to have in order to be able to operate a farm operation. And so people talked a lot about their own mental health and the physical health aspects of it. And then restoring power and agency, right? So that's a space that we can begin to think about, right? When folks join Black Farmers United of New York, right? Thinking about, oh my goodness, I have someone else that's maybe 20 or 30 miles away from me that understands what I'm going through. And that's incredible in terms of helping not just people's mental health, but just the sensibility factors of it. And so Henneman offers to us that trauma and healing can be passed down culturally. Even if we do not experience the trauma of forced servitude and near complete subordination to the whims of another, that trauma may still inform our personal and collective identity. Internalized racism is the adoption by people of color of racist attitudes and stereotypes towards members of our own ethnic group, including ourselves. And Henneman talks about, how to explore those facets, but also how to release that for the purpose of being able to live into your sense of purpose. And so some of those activities include dancing and art and being a part of caucuses, healing circles, prioritizing herbal medicine, right? Really beautiful spaces. And I just want to draw to your attention that that's where that collective work happens. That's where that relational work happens. And that's where there's collective meaning making and being able to come together. And so just to close out this particular chapter, as we work to capture carbon from the atmosphere and return it to the soil, we cool the planet. It's never just about growing food. Black land work is in a dynamic intergenerational manifestation about growing our souls to build the collective power and beloved community for our survival pending revolution, as the historical Black Panther Party articulates. We're deeply engaged in both the struggle to resist the dehumanization of our lives and to reimagine new ways of living together in our communities. And boy, does that sum up where we are with this process, right? It's never just about growing food, it's about something much larger than that. And so as I shift to our last chapter, I'll just share that I'm a youth development specialist. We're 4-H, right? A really large ag organization. And I selfishly wanted to have something to take into that world as well. And to be thinking about how do we apply these lessons directly to organizations and to ag organizations specifically. And so chapter 3 really looks at healing trauma. And I'll talk more specifically about trauma and my definition for trauma that I'm using in this work. But as a way of offering opportunities for our young people to inherit something really beautiful, thinking about how do we heal trauma before young people actually even think about moving onto land and think about their relationship with land. And so back to these wonderful farmers and also my colleague who sits right down here at the bottom. This is Dr. Tony Burrow. He is one of the leading experts on purpose and sense of purpose studies with young people. And so I wanted to think about an approach that would inform healing, but would also include a sense of purpose and specifically for young people. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the 3 values that are really at the base of this work. So purpose, which I've been hammering, and especially in the last chapter, thinking about healing and what that actually means and what people are being healed from. And then ultimately expanding what we think about in terms of wholeness and thinking about what is a hidden wholeness and how can we actually get to that space. And so I'll just reiterate that purpose is often seen as a driving force behind personal motivation, resilience, and well-being. And it helps people to create a framework for making decisions, setting goals, and navigating life challenges. And something else to note, I had talked about trauma earlier. As I coded the interview transcripts, I noticed that the theme of trauma emerged regardless of the question that I asked. So I could ask these Black farmers about where they grew up and what that was like for them. I could ask them about, who was instrumental in helping them to think about their food relationship and their relationship to land. But something that came up time and time again was trauma. And so I wanted to also think about where that's seated in this work. If there's ever a definition that's super important, it's this one. And Zaldiwa argues that trauma is a breach in one's reality caused by colonial abuses such as racism, sexism, or homophobia. Moreover, when people experience structural state-sanctioned violence on their bodies, boundaries, or identities, they may be shocked into a new way of seeing and being in the world. And thus trauma is an all-encompassing experience resulting in soul loss, a wound that disrupts all of our collective views on reality. When I saw this definition, I was like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what we've been experiencing. This is exactly what we've been writing about, been thinking about how we help to heal. And so in the same way, I'd like to offer for you that our definition of healing, according to Firth and Cowley and Pitterid, is that healing, that they define healing as a restorative, transformative process of repair or recovery resulting in positive change and finding meaning and movement towards self-realization of wholeness and greater strength, right? That's the space, that's the community that I would love to pass on, that I would love to be engaged in. And so how do we find that space? And so as a part of this work with these incredible Black farmers, we've learned that there's lots of different roads that lead to a rooted wholeness. And so I want to take you through what that could potentially look like, and specifically in the context of thinking about that for ag organizations that are working with young people. So I have a proposal. My proposal comes from 20 plus years of working as a youth development specialist. It comes from working shoulder to shoulder with these Black farmers and working with their organizations that include Backyard Farm Collective, University, New York City, Indigenous Mothers Community Land Trust, Soil and Souls. It also engages with sense of purpose studies, but in very discrete spaces. So my position at the university is situated within New York State 4-H. And so thinking about the 4-H context, I also have a position seated within Manners, and that organization's acronym stands for Minorities in Ag, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences. Manners was formed in 1982 as folks were thinking like, wow, there's lots of underrepresented folks in ag. How do we begin to build a cadre of folks that are working in ag? And also FFA, right? So this year was the first year that as a part of my work, we worked under Governor Hochul's office in order to bring together 4-H, FFA, and Manners so that those three major ag organizations would have an opportunity to not only play together, but also to learn from one another. And so I'd like to present to you some pathways to helping young people to really begin to heal their trauma. And I'll walk through this. The first place that I really have learned through my diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work is to seat everybody in a chance to think about their own identity and to do their own inner work. And so that starts with self-exploration. And so in my Cornell University Cooperative Extension DEIB work with our core leadership team, we use a social identity map as a tool, and I use it to get to know groups because there are parts of your identity that are visible, and there are parts of your identity that are really invisible, and that maybe in the course of your time, even in developing relationships, you might not ever get to know about someone else that you're working with. And so I use that as a space to start here, right? And learning about dominant and excluded identities, learning about those isms that we talked about earlier, and the different levels of oppression that we're all swimming in, and really creating an opportunity for folks to think about what is my identity and how does that help me to show up, right? And so that's the first place that we begin. And that social identity exploration can take us into learning about dominant and non-dominant identities, But then that creates an opportunity for us to really share our identity within a group, right? And we're talking about both young people and adults being able to do this. And that really leads to group identity formation that looks really different, right? As a part of those conversations, things that invariably come up are your trauma, your triggers, right? So you can begin to see how all of these pieces are now baked into how we not only do our programs, but how we begin to think about our own socialization, right? Many of us have been socialized into spaces where no one ever said anything to us, but there were really deep messages that were conveyed during that time of socialization and that continue to happen as a part of our experiences. I also think that after that social identity exploration, there's an opportunity to explore with one's family about not just their food story, but also their connection to land, right? And for many, that might be not knowing what lands they come from, but having some curiosity around that. And that's an exploration that can begin some really intergenerational work, and the work that comes back to being able to share stories and being able to share a sense of connection. That connection invariably will lead us to deeper connections, but also lots of questions, right? About where you come from, how you got here, what language you speak, what traditions you carry on. That also leads us to connection to other systems, right? And so a lot of times in our ag programs, we never even talk about the systems that our young people are swimming in, but that's an incredibly important space for us to be able to begin to navigate and to make transparent for young people the systems that are at play. And then ultimately, that could be a really great place for farm exploration. Another direction might be just through the storytelling piece of things. And that's a place where you can unpack shared histories. It's also a place where you might be able to dig into some of the myths that are really embedded in our food system and some of the food stories that we have about ourselves and about other people. And to begin to learn about the modern food system, right? And how those isms are baked into that modern food system. For me, right, learning about some of these stories also means learning about the stories of Black farmers and land. And so there's a lot of truth telling baked into those spaces, right? Where young people get to learn about how many farms were owned by Black folks, right? How braids were seeded, how seeds were braided into people's hair as they moved from one space to another, and not just the stories around slavery. I propose that looking at agriculture for Black families, specifically during the civil rights era, is another space of exploration. And then ultimately that's going to lead to connection and additional questions that can be explored within ag programs. But it's the jumping off point before anybody ever even touches the soil and begins to think about their relationship to food and to land. And so I'm proposing a seat at a healing table for trauma as an opportunity for us to really think through what we're able to offer to our youth through these agriculture programs. And so Rev Dell, who's one of the Black farmers that I was able to interview, was answering in this quote, what Soil and Souls contributes to the world and how they see race. And so what she says is, so really, that is our challenge. We have to get on the land because that's where our healing is. That's where our wealth and prosperity is. But what I've done is in terms of our work, we've just layered it so that we're very clear that we've created, some stepping stones so that people no longer just jump right into leadership training because they're not ready. They're too wounded, too sensitive, and prone to collapse to be leaders. And so we're creating a progression of services so that, people can just come and play. They can come and learn and play. And then after they've learned and played together, now let's see, can we lead together? And so what Rev was sharing here is that invariably, as a part of her work, the people aren't ready to inherit land. They're not ready to work land because they're working out their mental health, their physical health in that space. And so how about we not do it that way? How about we heal our trauma before we actually ever get to the land? And so I shared earlier that Rev Dell has played an instrumental part in this work because she helped for us to see how we could do that in modern day America, in the places that we all sit, and we're spending some time together on a monthly basis and working through working on committees and organizing ourselves. And that's incredible as we think about that. And so as I think about what new story do we tell together, it's really a story of unlearning, relearning, and having those breakthroughs. And that's where those connections are really going to be based for our ag programs. I will share that last year I was delighted to write a grant with Dr. Jackie Davis Manigault of Cornell University Cooperative Extension in New York City. We wrote a 5-year federally funded grant for USDA to grow urban agriculture with young people in New York City. And that program is called the 4-H SciFar Legacy Program. Within USDA, they have a special funding line called SciFar, which stands for Children, Youth, and Families at Risk. And while I don't actually use that terminology, I use children, youth, and families as resources. We certainly have created an opportunity for young people to think about and think through what urban ag contributes to the landscape of agriculture. So I'm super excited for that programming. And one of the things that I'm excited for is to, really spend some time embedding in an opportunity for us to read things like Freedom Farmers with our young people so that our team leaders get to know about stories of resistance, stories of Black love as a part of the Black freedom movement. And so Monica White does a really incredible job of that. And so we'll be reading that as a part of our 4-H SciFar Legacy program. I'd be remiss to not plug Dr. Bobby J. Smith's book, Food, Power, and Politics, the food story of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, right? And so I plan to share Dr. Smith's work because we need to look at how food became weaponized, right, during the Civil Rights Movement, how food is going to become weaponized and has become weaponized in our current food movement, and what we can do about that, especially in the urban ag space. And that ultimately, a fun space for young people to think about as we have young people coming from all sectors of New York City that may live close to Coney Island or in the Rockaways, to think about beaches as unique spaces, but beaches as spaces that have become central spaces for colonization. And so we'll be reading The Land Was Ours and learning about how Black beaches became white wealth in the coastal South. And so really incredible. So I want to leave you with a couple of things. I want to close out with an ode to healing because it's really important for us to be able to retell stories and to tell them the right way and to make sure that the truth telling is embedded in them. Black people have always been people of the lands and farmers. And I wanted to take the gleanings from my methodology paper, from my paper on the race and the pursuit of purpose, and also think about how do we build in healing spaces for young people, and that they don't have to impact their trauma on the land, but they do have to know the truth of what the land holds for them. And so Monica White, in her last chapter of Freedom Farmers, uses a Bell Hooks quote that says, "Collective Black self-recovery takes place when we begin to renew our relationship to the earth, when we remember the way of our ancestors. Living in modern society without history, it's been easy to forget that Black people were first and foremost people of the land and farmers." So I'd like to have so many people to acknowledge, but I'd first like to acknowledge my bio family. My mom is here, and I know that I have family that's here online, I believe. I see my dad is there. My family has watched me work 3 jobs in this employee degree program, survive surgeries and a tumor to finish this degree. And so I want to thank them and acknowledge them. There were plenty of days that my mom tried to turn the TV off so that I could get work done, and I totally appreciate that. I have a beloved family in QC, New York City. Prior to coming here as a part of the university, I worked with QC New York City on a separate SciFar program, and they have encouraged me beyond measure. When I said that I was leaving from Cooperative Extension in New York City to come back to Cornell, people were upset. But a shout out to my QC New York City family. They continue to encourage me. To the chair of my committee and my advisor, to Scott Peters, who's been a coach and a mentor. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for believing in this work. Also to my other committee members, Dr. Tony Burrow and Dr. Jennifer Minner, They serve on my committee, but they've also helped me to dream boldly. And I'd like to thank the community of friends and family that are here who took over community projects so that I could contribute in a different way. I'd definitely like to thank the Black farmers who said yes, and who I've been delighted to be in a relationship with, and I'll continue to be in relationships with. And last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge my late colleague, Dr. June Mead. She was the first person to support me as a part of my PhD journey. She'd written the letter before I had even talked about applying. And so I just want to recognize my late friend who wrote an enthusiastic letter of support, and before I knew that I actually even needed it. And I'd like to continue to encourage you to find joy and justice in the work that you're doing. Some of my next steps include a project with Tuskegee University. I gave a similar talk at the Black Urban Growers Conference in Houston, Texas this year, just to test out my healing approach to ag programs. And one of my colleagues bit, and so we're building out a healing ag-based program at Tuskegee University. I've been invited to co-author a book on innovations in food security, but not by myself, with these Black farmers that I've been doing this work with. So I'm incredibly proud of that as well. And at this time, I will say thank you and take any questions that you all have.
I have a question. Hello?
When we can hear.
Awesome. Pleasure, everyone. Franklin Alejandro Mena here. My question is more in the aspect of what motivated this, what motivated your passion around agriculture. Also, congratulations, right? Let's acknowledge the amazing work that you've been able to do and this amazing moment that you have here, and congratulations on that. But what motivated it? What motivated your passion around farming or your passion around education? What pushed you to get to this particular moment?
Thank you, Franklin. Thank you for your work. Thank you for the question. I think the things that really motivated me were my activism and my work in community. Being in a community like Ithaca where there's a town gown and you're intimately aware of what the town gown is, I always want to show up as my best self. And while research is something that I'm passionate about, I'm also passionate about being in community. And I wanted to create an opportunity to not just do work for the sake of doing work or to have letters behind my name, but to do incredible work that was going to help to build capacity within community. And so I saw that in this space, that was going to be a really incredible space. I also happen to, as a youth development specialist, work for an ag organization. And so I wanted to think about what contributions I might be able to make in that space as well. And so that was super important to me and helped to motivate this work. I will say I was definitely impassioned by the relationships that I was able to develop with these set of farmers, and hopefully that I'll be able to develop as we move into some additional work. And that you all actually help to keep me going and keep me sane.
I have a question, and like Franklin, I want to say, woo, 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 woo. I'm so happy you are here. But my question is, did you get any pushback from the academic community on this research as relationship approach?
Rev, you always know how to hit the nail on the head. Thank you for the question, Rev, and for the encouragement. Yes, there's a lot of pushback around having a scientific approach to being able to conduct social science research and conducting interviews. And I think that there's going to be a lot more pushback in terms of that research relationships actually engage people in much more deeper relationships, and so that the quality of the actual material is actually much richer, and that there's no way to really go against that. As you look at the quality of the material, I mean, and the work that we were able to do together, I think that if I was just like landing on you, Rev, and saying, hey, can you answer these set of questions, right? What would have resulted would have been completely different, right? I would have never have gotten to know about the nature-based work that you're engaged in. I would have never have known about the Indigenous Mothers Community Land Trust, right? And the myriad of people that you all help to impact. And so there just wouldn't have been a way. So the pushback is okay, but I think that the results really do speak for themselves. Other questions? Yeah, go for it, David.
You're gonna have first.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing the hospitality into our research community by emphasizing on we and community, especially during the time, like the weird time many people talk about just me and economic values. I really appreciate it. I really love your explanation about bringing community into academic, not bringing academic to community. So I'm wondering how you interpret this, like bringing community into academia in your own research. And second question is, do you see the healing processes not only from the agricultural programs, but also agriculture itself? Like, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those two questions. So the first question is how I integrate community into academics. We had this really great talk a couple of years ago. It was Mama Kay. So if you all know Karen Washington, she was here on campus and we had this really lovely panel. And so people would ask questions like, if you have IRB, do you administer the IRB onto people? No, absolutely not, right? So John is smiling, but John Raymond is here. He's been a really wonderful shining light here in this community. He does work through the Lehman Alternative Community School. And so one of the first things that I did when I came here as a grad student was that I had a presidential fellowship, and it meant that I couldn't work. But it didn't mean that I couldn't push myself into community. So the first thing I did was I knocked on the doors at the Greater Ithaca Activity Center. Every Friday night, all my teens and preteens know I was there, right? If there was programming, I was there, even on a Friday night, right? So most people aren't giving up a Friday night, but I was like, these are teens, right? We can make some concessions. And I made sure that if they had programming, I was there. And I didn't come with a set of excuses, right? I just came. Right? And I made that a part of my commitment. So John Raymond has picked up a food pantry, right? That's been really helping to literally feed community here. They distribute milk, eggs, and bread at this point, and sometimes other things. And that came as a part of one of the projects that I happen to be engaged in, right? So one of those first things is just like rolling off of the campus, right, and into community, right, and ingratiating yourself in spaces so that people get to see you, right, so they don't know me as anything other than Jamila. And actually, funny enough, I was in Staples just the other day returning something, and this young man named Riley said to me, hey, are you Miss Jamila? Oh my God, right, like we worked on this food project together, right, and so we rescue food. Wegmans, from Walmart, from Green Star, even from the Statler here on campus, and redistributed in community, right? It's something that seems so basic, but something that's really incredible, especially for families that are making ends meet, and especially in today's economy. And so what do we do there? We not just show up, but we develop relationships. And so John has been just a master of helping to develop those relationships. Riley, who was at the Staples working, is home from school for the semester. But he talks about the ways in which he helped to really integrate himself into community. And that's one of the spaces, right? Take anything that you have an interest in and figure out how you get to do that in community. As a part of this work, one of the jobs that I held was with the Ithaca City School District. So I'm really good about noticing things. And so one of the other spaces that I occupied was that I noticed that the graduation rate for Ithaca High School had some numbers on it. right? And sometimes we knew that those numbers were attached to kids hanging out on corners. And sometimes those were attached to kids that I actually knew from the preteen program that I worked at as part of my master's degree at the Great Activity Center. So one day I went to the superintendent and I said to him, hey, I know some of the kids that are in this deficit in your graduation rate. What would it take for me to work one-on-one with them? And he said, well, the board has to pass you as an alternative instructor. You have to have this set of credentials. I was like, great, no problem, right? So I became an alternative instructor. I did that during the pandemic. I worked one-on-one with kids in classrooms, and I graduated young people from the high school that are doing fantastic things right now, but that maybe weren't doing such great things at that particular time, right? Just from noticing and figuring out what skills did I have as a youth development specialist, where was my sphere of influence, how could I help to influence other people? And so I spent a long time helping to graduate folks. Luckily, I graduated my last young person doing that. That's really hard work to work one-on-one with young people in addition to all the other things you have going on. But that was a place where I could help to give in community, right? And so some people know me as Miss Jamila, like the hard ass of like, I have a high school diploma already if you're trying to get one, right? Like we got to figure out how do we meet in the middle, but thinking about what tangible skills do I have to help build capacity within community. And so that's where I started. A lot of my projects here at the university and those partnerships are really important because I think about what I have to contribute and not just what I can contribute, but also in addition to the myriad of folks that are here. In my courses, I try to create opportunities for lived experience to come up against, right, everything else. And to make sure that they're not juxtaposed, but it comes in as an option, right? And so when I invited Franklin to serve as a co-instructor, I invited the pastor of the St. James AME Zion Church to come in as a co-instructor. We were looking to build a commissary kitchen at the St. James AME Zion Church here in Ithaca. It's the oldest church in the AME Zion family. And they spiritually feed people, but they didn't have a kitchen to feed people, right? So being a part of the BCTR family, I was like, we could figure this out. We could turn this into a course, right? We helped to demo their kitchen and get them to a place where then they could put in floors and work towards having a kitchen. That in turn helped them to make sure that they had a kitchen space because right at the corner is the Southside Community Center. And when their kitchen, which is a big generous about them having a kitchen, they have a really small space. When their kitchen went down, they could then go to the St. James AME Zion Church and use their space. So just thinking about like, where am I, what's my sphere of influence, and how do I begin to invite people in? Your second question was about healing and ag in this space. Remind me of the question.
Yeah, that's right. You explained a lot of agricultural programs. And so this is from the strategies. Did you see like this from agricultural activities?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I talked about the physical health piece of things, one of our farm partners had put together. We began having conversations about innovations in the food system. And so I began having conversations with folks about spaces and how they could double as other spaces so that they could have additional funding streams. So this particular farmer had 6 kids. And so his kids would come stay with him on the farm. His kids were situated in New York City, but he was managing this parcel of land in upstate New York. So his kids would come during school breaks and during the summer. And so he began to put together a workout protocol for his kids, right? In order to think about their mental and their physical health, but also to impact their physical health. And got so good at it that he began to invite other people in and charge them a fee to be able to do that, right? Can you imagine Farm Olympics of some kind of sort that people are signing up for? No longer going to CrossFit, right? You could come right to the farm and get some chores done and also become physically fit, right? So that was a tangible funding stream. Thinking about things like respite and offering opportunities for folks to come on the farm, right? Farm to table dinners that my colleagues also put together. So just thinking through where those pieces can really balance. And then thinking about the piece around building power and agency, then creating those opportunities for the farmers to get in touch with folks so that they could figure out how to put these things into practice. And especially during the winter months where there was more downtime, so that they could turn their attention to doing that or building a business plan and figuring out how they can make their economics work. And then the last space that I'll talk about that really does involve young people is that, and Ocasio is on here, here in the county, I serve as a person that can provide adult supervision in the foster care system. So my home is certified for foster care for runaway youth, for homeless youth. And I was like, it'd be really great to actually have young people not be in an office space, not to be supervised in that space, but to have them supervised on a farm. And so we began doing that, and we saw that there was actually a lot of traction that we were able to get. And so Ocasio, who is logged on here, and I have written a grant for Albany County for their social services to consider farms as sites for supervision versus having folks be in a classroom space or in a space in social services, right? Where you're now beginning to begin to enter into a new relationship with your parent. And so that was also an incredible space, right? To think about, families belting together, feeding pigs, feeding animals that are on the farm, and also beginning to work out their relationship with one another. So thank you for that question.
Kind of going back and forth between two. You can pick one. So one of them is high level and the other one is more about your practical experience. So I'll start with the second one, which is, so you came to PhD program doing this work from and stayed in extension. And you talked a little bit about that. You kind of ended up your last chapter really about how do you apply these activities. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of the experience of what you're able to bring to the table of writing a dissertation as an extension person who kept working through the whole time. So that's one question. And I'm personally most interested in sort of thinking about that from the unrealized potential of extension as a system to do more than it does at the kind of work that you're talking about. And then second question is, I think the issues that you brought up, and centered in some of your earlier work about meaning and purpose are just like so fundamental and important. And there's some parts of, let's call it broadly speaking, social science that really focus on those questions, but a lot of social science doesn't at all and takes it for granted. So there's a specific question there, which I don't think meaning and purpose are the same things. And I just wonder if you could talk about a little more about, because you almost use them interchangeably, about how you would distinguish them, particularly, and I'm really interested in that, especially in the context, maybe too much, but in the context of working with young people who are at a different place in their lives about thinking about purpose and meaning than, let's say, the farmers who are already adults that you're working.
What a great set of questions, David. I would expect no less. So, having worked in extension, I will say that when I think about Black farmers and my work in extension, so we're here at an 1862 institution, right, which affords us a level of support and financing, even during these times, right, as a land-grant institution. My counterparts that work at 1890 institutions, which are historically Black colleges and universities, 1994 institutions, which are tribal colleges and universities, don't have nearly as many opportunities as we do here. And so I always try to create an opportunity to do some paired research and some work. So this work that will be upcoming at Tuskegee University is incredible because that means that I can utilize the resources that are here in that space, right, where they don't have access to the same level of funding, but certainly the innovation is there, right? The ideas are there, the people are there. And so then how do we begin to raise the profile of our other colleagues that are other land-grant institutions that maybe don't get as much play. Now, for me, Tuskegee is like an amazing place to be, but many folks don't have that same relationship with HBCUs or even with our tribal colleges and universities. And so how do we make that commonplace, right? So a couple of years ago, I had written a grant, and one of our partners was Kentucky State University, and K-State is a HBCU in Kentucky. And so I was like, here is the grant that I wrote, literally verbatim. Let me know if you need help with this. And they turned it into a partner and they got funded, right? At the same level that we were funded here at this land grant. And so, right, we have to do more than that, right? We really have to look at the systems that are at play and create those opportunities. And so that's one place in which I think about this work. I think the other place that I think about this work, and especially in extension, is, a space that I will say is an ode to Scott, in terms of being in spaces where you can tell the truth about where you are, right? So I'm here at a land grant institution, and that's great. But we're seated in land, right, that's untaxed, right? And so how do we move into community where we talk to folks about that, right? My position within the Ithaca City School District, right? There's lots of folks whose houses you pass by that are asking for the university to pay its fair share of taxes here, right? And so when you're in spaces, and certainly in working with extension, being able to tell the truth about, right, what you're able to do, but also about where we are and where we're currently seated and what that affords us, and maybe what that doesn't afford us to be able to say. And so I think in occupying those spaces, that's the number one thing that's in the back of my mind. And then working with our partners to dismantle systems, right? So, right, some of those are in funding mechanisms, but some of those are also in the hierarchy around who gets tenure and how you earn tenure, right? So looking at those discrete systems as well. For myself, and certainly for the trajectory that I'm on, the area of research that I'm looking and to be focused in could potentially continue in extension. And so how do we help for folks to build out their portfolio in extension, right? Something that it's a space where we're not even continuing to hire. I mean, we have a hiring freeze, that's a whole other thing, but it's not a space that we're continuing to hire faculty to move into. So how do we begin to continue to tell a good story, right, if we don't have folks that are still occupying those spaces? And then I think the last piece of that is that within extension, baked into our system, is that you have to have a minimum credential of a master's degree, right, in order to be able to do much of anything. And so we have lots of talented folks, right, that are working in community as community educators who maybe don't have those credentials, but are certainly doing that work. How do we fix that system so that we're having a different kind of conversation? Because we do have folks that are talented and that are overqualified at the table if we begin to look at the qualifications differently. Right, so that's the first one. The meaning and purpose piece is one I could talk to you about all day. And so I do believe that for young people, in the role that I play with New York State 4-H as a civic engagement specialist, right? As an adult, it is my job to pay attention to what sparks young people's interests, right? And that's intrinsically tied to their sense of purpose. For those young people that I was working with in the district, there was nothing in that classroom space that kept that light burning behind their eyes, right? It was like, oh, I could do this other thing. I could be hanging out on the corner. I could be selling drugs. Right? Those were the things that helped to keep that fire burning for them. And so I had to think about what's going to be the carrot to help for them to continue, right? In those same spaces, I also had to think about how do I help them to shape their sense of purpose, right? How do I help them to shape how they make meaning in the world and how they see themselves, right? So that's individual. That's based on their own ideas of how they see themselves. The role that I play is in helping them to figure out what is my purpose, right? What is my reason for being? Why am I here? What do I have to contribute, whether it be in the school community or in the community at large? And in that space, they get to determine, right, what their sense of purpose is, right? And in that space, they get to really decide on their own meaning, which is which is just one small part of purpose, right? The fullness of the purpose, right, really is in how you show up, what that context is, right? And thinking through who are the other Spark champions along the way, they're gonna help me to meet that space. And I think that there are organizations like 4-H and FFA, and even Manners that do that really well. And usually it's outside of the context of a job or even educational pathway. And so I can tell you that for Keyshawn Payne, who I worked with, he goes by the name of Tank. His purpose was to make sure that he did everything that he could do to take care of his grandmother. That was his sense of purpose. And so that meant he needed to find a job that was different than the job that he had before, in order to take care of his grandmother, to make sure she didn't have to work as hard. And that was his carrot, that was his driving force. And so when I would meet with him, I would remind him, right, my purpose and how I see the world is probably completely different than yours. But I want you to use that as a driving force in order to get to this particular point, which is graduating from high school. And so that's it's a portion of, it's a much longer conversation for sure, David, but I will say that as we're looking in spaces and thinking about young people's sense of purpose, I'd like to be in spaces where there are drivers for that, and to just be one of those adult Spark champions on the pathway, right? Helping them to figure out, right, am I alive in this space? Does this really work for me? Can I see myself here? And one of those spaces that we do that incredibly well is in our 4-H Career Explorations program, where we invite kids here to campus and we ask every single postdoc, undergrad, graduate student, faculty member to share. How did you get into this career? How do you remain here? What helps you to remain seated here? And who are the people along the way that helped you to realize that this was your small slice of the world?
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. So much for those of you joining us online as well. Thank you so much.